Welcome back to the afternoon session. My name is Dennis Crouch. I'm a law professor here at the law school. I teach property and also intellectual property law classes. Melissa asked me to come and introduce her. Right, of course. Melissa Berry is a visiting professor here at the law school, and she came in this summer and took on kind of some huge roles. We asked her to teach several new classes that she's never taught before, and stepped up and has done that, and the students love her. We asked her to take on leading this journal, and she stepped up and did that. And most importantly for today, she took on the role of organizing this whole event and the symposium issue that's going to come out later. And so thank you very much, Melissa. That's great. Thank you. Seriously. I'm very short with introductions. You know, before coming here, Melissa's taught both at the University of Washington and at Chapman Law School in California. She has an interesting career prior to joining academia, including clerking on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which is really kind of a hotbed for administrative law, including environmental law, and worked at a couple of different kind of big-name law firms following that. She has her JD from Northwestern, bachelor's degree from Tulane, but we're just happy to have her today. Melissa Berry, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think in all of the activity for today, I had a moment where I wondered, why did I put myself on this schedule? Because I heard so many things this morning that I've been trying to assimilate in what previously was a fairly organized presentation. There are all these ideas bouncing around, so some of them may be popping in unexpected places. We'll see how that goes. But I do want to try to incorporate some of them because I think we just had some really great ideas come both from speakers and from the audience as well. So it's really exciting to have everyone here. I'm going slightly maverick, not using PowerPoint, except for my dramatic moment here. Does anyone know what that is? You don't count. Or where this is, or when? Anyone who has not studied environmental justice? Heard about it? 60s? Later? Should we, anyone want to venture, I guess? Or should we cheat and go to people who know what we're looking at? Cheat, all right.
Okay, Warren County.
Warren County,
Yeah,
yes.
in the 80s.
In the 80s. Right. And the reason I ask that is because it harkens back to other pictures most people in our country have seen from civil rights movement 20 years earlier, more or less, right? 80s, Warren County, North Carolina. Community residents literally laying down in front of trucks that were coming to dump contaminated chemicals into their community. Now, in the end, this is one of environmental justice's success stories, but much more or less, but much later, not at this particular time. Protesting environmental harm at just this very grassroots level, laying down in front of the trucks. And most of you have never heard about it. Why is that? What is environmental justice? We've heard this phrase a few times before, and maybe if you've taken environmental law recently, you've heard it pop in, or you've read it in your casebook, or sometimes it comes up in land use, particularly if you're in Professor Arnold's class or my class. Some law schools have a class in environmental justice. I've taught a seminar in environmental justice. But it's something that many of us haven't really heard of, haven't seen this, and don't really have a full grasp on what it is. Now, that's something because what a full grasp is one of the problems. It's one of the challenges, excuse me. It's one of the challenges of the complexity of this area of law, if we want to call it that. I mean, it has become an area of law, but it is really so interdisciplinary that it doesn't fit in one of those boxes that we saw in Professor Arnold's presentation or in the silos of the rest of our environmental law framework. So it's an area that's either kind of been ignored or pushed aside, or now, we'll see, maybe kind of getting integrated. So we'll finish with a hopeful note of integration and what's being integrated into what we think is happening in the fourth generation of environmental law. But its history is one that we just haven't heard the story, and we don't have time to go into the full story, but you get a sense from this of how environmental justice, as we now call it, the origins of it were really this kind of oppositional, literally having to protest things being dumped into a community, and really grew up in that way and being called environmental racism. And over the years, environmental racism became environmental injustice and now is fairly well accepted, known as environmental justice, although there's still different terms being used in the literature depending on what field you're in. In the law, we tend to use environmental justice, but outside the law, they still are using some other terms, including environmental equality or environmental equity. And one question I want to pose, we won't necessarily get to an answer, is, it's kind of like class, is when you change a term like that, does it change the meaning of what we're talking about? Environmental racism was described really as you know, in these earlier days as environmental inequality, environmental racism, which is focusing on broader dimensions of environmental equality and social hierarchies, and trying to get at, I'm looking at a definition from those early days, and I want to make sure to get it right, that focus on social inequality and environmental burdens. And this is one of the challenges, is because it's such a complex problem. Earlier we were talking about climate change, and even within climate change, environmental justice issues as part of climate change, the challenges presented by climate change. So the fact that environmental justice basically grew out of not just the environmental movement, but coupled with civil rights, and did it a little bit later. Right? First we have civil rights as a social movement, then we have the environmental movement, if you will, in the 1970s, and a lot of what we talked about, first generation environmental law. But then in the 80s, this came. Now that's not to say this wasn't happening before the 80s. This is just when some attention, some awareness, some opposition really started to happen in a more vocal way, and in some sense also that we know that social movements like this, sometimes they just have to happen at that right moment in time. You know, Ralph Nader wasn't the first one to talk about auto safety, But that timing of bringing that awareness, Rachel Carson in Silent Spring, rivers starting on fire, all the things that sort of coalesce a society that is ready to understand that there is some kind of problem or challenge. But for environmental justice, we're still learning. It didn't catch on in that same way. It's been very localized. So early on, there was a lot of focus, this sort of pioneers in this. Warren County is this case that is pointed to as when the awareness and some community really took action in the way they thought that they could make it be the most effective, given their resources, given their understanding of how the institutional processes work, the administrative processes to allow this to happen. And over the years, and we don't have time to get into all of this, a lot of the questions that have been asked are about, well, these problems seem to either early on were recognized as dumping, location basically of hazardous waste, really kind of growing out of land use, a lot of them, citing decisions about where to put, why is there yet another chemical plant in a low-income African-American neighborhood. Why was that happening? So there was a lot of focus early on about cause and effect, and which came first, the neighborhood or the site, the plant, all of that. And we're not going to get into that today. But it has been a challenge for this area, this field, not just of law, but that cuts across law, social sciences, and many other areas connected to the problems that arise out of what we generally call environmental justice, that are many of which are rooted in poverty. Some are rooted in racism. I'm not here today to get at that cause, but that's been a subject of much debate that's kind of presented a bit of a cog in moving environmental justice forward in the same way that we heard earlier how environmental law has moved forward and evolved. And what we did see is early on, we have Warren County protests, we have Dr. Robert Bullard, who came out with a book in 1990 based on a lot of things that were happening in the 80s called Dumping in Dixie. There was a lot of attention in North Carolina, Louisiana, places with names like Chemical Valley, Cancer Alley, things like that. And what emerged from these early works were that the minority, particularly African American and low-income communities, have been left out of decision-making process, public decision-making processes for environmental policy. It was argued that these same groups are at a disadvantage because they lack equal access to information, or they don't understand the process, they don't have representation or resources for the kind of representation to participate at the same level as other communities might. And then back to this, the evidence issue about we can see that there is some kind of unequal distribution of environmental harms and burdens on these communities. But again, kind of fighting over what's driving that. Is inequity driven by economic forces, or is it intentional discrimination? And that latter term comes in because environmental justice has kind of had to use available tools and existing legal regimes, existing institutions, and one that the movement has had some success with is the Civil Rights Act. But it's not an exact fit. So some of that terminology of civil rights starts taking on, and then everyone's fighting about, was it intentional discrimination, or not? Was it institutional discrimination? And so those questions are lingering, and they have affected the evolution of environmental justice. So environmental justice, as we see, has evolved in some generational way from this grassroots kind of protest, which I would call the first generation. It was not an organized effort. It was not like environmental law with, now we have a more overarching regulatory structure. It was individual communities. And remember, at this time, right, it's hard to think about this time, but we weren't all connected in the same way. It was harder to have communities get information to each other than it is now with a touch of, on your keyboard. So isolated incidents of reactions and grassroots efforts, largely through protests and litigation. That's the first generation. The catalyst being the people who were affected in these communities. So from the ground up, and Luke Cole, who was one of the catalysts of this movement himself, the pioneers who represented some of these communities, wrote a book later called From the Ground Up, and it is about this first generation. It's really the opposite of what happened at the beginning in the first generation of environmental law. Just to flip it on its head. From the ground up. The next, and it really got that conversation started, similar to what Elizabeth was saying earlier about maybe not even expecting to win, hoping because it's their safety and their health at issue, but, and not in an organized way necessarily bringing a strategic lawsuits, they really were hoping to win, but it did get a conversation started. The second generation is you have, in particular, right, at this time, still environmental racism was the terminology for quite a while. And in 1991, there's people of colors came together and had a declaration, which was really about environmental justice. And it shows how broad we're thinking about health and safety and homes and housing and transportation and really kind of getting down to basic human rights. 1991. 1994, we have an executive order that has come out. We're now celebrating the 20th anniversary of this executive order. 20 years. Most people are still trying to figure out what is actually supposed to be happening, even people who study this, what is supposed to be happening under that executive order. This is what I would call the second generation. So it came out, but now 20 years later, the EPA has actually rolled out their EJ Plan 2014. Now they are, and I don't think we'll have time to put it up there, but they're rolling out the plan on how to implement the executive order that they've been subject to for 20 years. Now, I'm not here to criticize them because actually their plan is very fourth generation. So I want to be able to get to that. That's kind of the second generation. What I would say right now is environmental justice, even though it started later as a movement, is really also in a third generation, moving into fourth in some ways. But most of the work has been done not from the top down federal government, but at the state level and at local level. So municipalities and states in particular, Oregon, New Jersey, either through executive orders and some legislation, have been trying to address environmental justice or at least integrate it. So we really do see some of that laboratory we've been talking about, and tribes would be another area, except they don't, the issues that we were talking about is a little bit different. Here we're talking about getting involved in the process but these laboratories, and that is actually happening. Now, something that is, I think, unique about, and well, one of the many things that's unique about environmental justice is that the approach is already multimodal. So it's already kind of in this fourth generation. There's already some integration going on, but a lot of it still is fragmented. But it doesn't have a silo problem because it doesn't actually fit anywhere, which is part of why nobody quite knows what to do with it. So instead, there's been sort of a scattershot of how to address this problem by the executive branch, both at the federal level and the state level, get an executive order. By the judicial branch, again, where it started, really, through litigation. By the fourth branch, agencies trying to figure out how to integrate. By the legislature, not Congress, but others, but some state legislatures, mostly focused on hazardous waste, but there's still some activity. So the problem is being addressed across the branches, and one leaving out, not an official branch, but private. And there's a lot of tension there, because mostly what we have are private businesses wanting to do their business in a particular community. So that didn't come out quite right, but they want to come in, and there's some tension. There's now an emphasis on cooperation, collaboration, but there's still that tension. So across the spectrum, and also in multiple scales. So as we move into this fourth generation, the question is, will this fourth generation of environmental law embrace environmental justice? And I think it will, because it fits with, if we think we're going this direction that we've been talking about all day, we have something that works really well and adapts to a multimodal approach, because you're getting at this problem in a variety of ways. If we can integrate these, and it's happening, communities are connecting, and the EPA is getting involved and providing guidance and some negotiation with the private corporations, and helping sort of shepherd the process from an early time on, and encouraging best practices by companies who, particularly this relating to siting, which still remains one of the biggest issues. So that's happening. So environmental justice really lends itself to this fourth generation. Yet there are some challenges. Still looking for the right legal claim, for the right remedy. And it's unlikely to come in the form of, and it really wouldn't fit fourth generation environmental law to have an environmental justice statute. I don't think that will happen anytime soon in Congress for all the reasons we already discussed today. But even if we did, it's really a panacea. It's really not going to solve the challenges that environmental justice faces. But some of these challenges, instead of being seen as a barrier, actually lend themselves to opportunities in this fourth generation environmental law. Because you can work across in this multimodal way, because it evolved in a spontaneous way, in a non-linear way, in a decentralized way, that actually can help a transition into this next generation. The challenge will be not to lose it or try to keep it separate and not integrate it. The goal is to, at this point, as I see it, is to stop fighting about the cause and try to deal with what is evident and try to identify possible ways to see what the connections are with other areas, not just with environmental law, but with transportation, with fair housing, right? gentrification issues, with food. A lot of these issues are very central to the core, one of the core problems in environmental justice, which has moved from being just about race to having a much broader definition, which now incorporates socioeconomic status, for some even argue gender and other sort of all differences, all marginalized populations. At some point we could say maybe the definition becomes so broad, what exactly are we talking about? Are we really just saying all environmental harms should be distributed equally? That argument's out there, right? But part of what I think the fourth generation of environmental justice is about is not just about the burdens, which is what most of the fighting has been about, but about the benefits. And this is the resilience building piece of fourth generation environmental law, is that environmental justice has moved from an oppositional, reactive movement to a proactive movement with resilience building possibilities, communities finding ways to connect, initially over one problem with two sides. But now by building a lot of these connections and trying to make their community more resilient in many ways, the idea of environmental justice has expanded from just trying to fight burdens from being disproportionately placed on your community to accessing the benefits of the environment, to be able to connect with the environment. I mean, a lot of this is focused in urban, but it extends also to rural areas. It extends to workers like farm workers. They have environmental justice issues. Once you start expanding this definition, it goes beyond just burden to some of the groups doing work that Tony mentioned earlier today, the City Project and Little Village in Chicago, that are working on access to parks, green space, green infrastructure, green housing. These are all opportunities to view environmental justice not just as a barrier and a very combative litigant status where there's always going to be a winner or loser, to something that is very hopeful, that's very positive, that's about more than just keep the harm away. It's about also there are these benefits, there are natural resources, and if you view it in this more expansive way, communities aren't just fighting. They are enjoying and connecting with the environment around them. They are part of, whether they know it or not, or have ever called it this, a social ecological system. Wherever they exist, humans connected with nature. And whether they call what they're doing resilience building or not, they are building resilience in their communities and sharing information and becoming stronger, supporting each other. So when those natural disasters happen, and we tend to think of Katrina from an emergency planning point of view, but it also is an environmental justice issue, going back to the roots of land use and the planning and how do they, why were the low-income and largely African-American populations in the low-lying areas that were going to be destroyed. So it's such a complex issue, but these challenges actually are something that can be used as opportunities and are already just on a quieter level from the ground up, but we also need to be working from the top down. And both of these things need to be happening, and kind of all the things in between, state, local, federal, because not one institution, not one level of government is going to be able to address this challenge in a comprehensive way. It really is too complex. So what if it is everyone's working on it in this laboratory and trying to integrate. Yes, we'll have some fallout. Yes, some things won't get integrated. But hopefully information will be shared and bridges will be built. Some silos will be broken down. And there will be progress. And there will be prospects for more hope. Thank you.
Professor Barry, let me put a hypothetical out for you.
Oh boy, okay. It's a role reversal here.
When protecting the environment, an environmental justice case. Let me give you an example. This is real. The United States Environmental Protection Agency in the state of Missouri alone has racked up over $300 billion worth of capital improvements as a matter of law in the Clean Water Act. In KCK, on the Kansas side, they've racked up $1 billion of mandatory improvements. The majority of the citizens in KCK are disadvantaged. They're in the $15,000 poverty range. Their sewer bills will go up to $100 a month. They won't be able to eat. They won't be able to buy their prescriptions. They won't be able to give clothes on their kids. So when does that case get put into your lexicon? Okay? I will also throw out to you that cities, one of their major functions is to deal with our detritus. They've been created for that purpose. They handle waste, they handle drinking water, they handle garbage, they handle all the things we don't want. So when you properly enforce environmental law, when you're enforcing environmental law against major cities, the majority of major cities consist of disadvantaged populations. Okay? So when does protecting the environment in and of itself become an environmental justice matter? I will also throw out to you in rural Missouri, almost every rural Missouri town, the average demographic is the majority of the population is over 60. Okay? They are on public assistance in the form of Social Security or regular benefits, and EPA is requiring them to replace all their wastewater treatment plants and all their drinking water supplies, in spite of the fact that the average populations continue to go age. In other words, they've been drinking the water for years. Why change it? So when does environmental justice apply to protecting the environment? And my argument is it does. Okay, and that's one of the cases we've been working on.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting challenge, and it shows that there are, in trying to kind of deal with things separately and not being able to address all the issues, because dealing with, okay, we have this particular regulation that tells us we have to enforce in this way, and can legally the EPA take into account some of the other issues that you've raised? I think it presents a real challenge, and it's exactly part of the problem of environmental justice doesn't have a vehicle.
Nor does it have a boundary.
It doesn't have that, which can be present the challenge in the sense of it's too broad, it doesn't really fit, and it doesn't really have a legal tool to get that challenge addressed.
I would argue,
I think it's a great
and one of the items that I'd ask you to consider as you go through your exercise is that this concept is one of those selective criteria. In other words, there's not uniformity to it. It's used. Okay? It's used by interest groups on the outside.
Calling it an environmental justice issue?
Yes.
I see.
But when it becomes an issue of when the government is creating a scenario when in the guise of protecting is excessive for the population and its economics in particular, it's avoided completely. So I just throw it out because it's a true case we're working on. And I want students in here to understand that it's not always corporations
Right,
who
yes.
this is about.
Yeah.
Okay? It is about the government, how the government acts, how the government deals with the scenarios, and the risks it puts on the population through its conduct.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to talk to you more about your case. And I probably put a little too much emphasis on, corporations without saying what everybody, I think pretty much everybody in this room knows, which is, this was permitted. This was, for instance, what we're looking at, and in your situation too, is just government decisions that were allowing certain things to happen. So when things are regulated, and that's part of the challenge of environmental justice, is if you're wondering, is there indirect or direct discrimination going on through the decision-making process by the regulators? Sorry, I know we have some in the rooms, but just how do you address that? And how do you challenge that in court? Under what theories? So I'd love to hear some more about that. I think we're starting to run out of time though. Yes.
Could you give a concrete example of what you consider to be a success in terms of environmental justice and how it might have come about?
I'm trying to remember the name of the town right now. There is a recent example. I don't think I brought the name up here with me, but I can get it to you. In which I just heard someone from. Now, again, the source was the EPA talking about this successful example, but they were talking about an example of basically their best practices that the EPA has proposed being put into action, and they're mostly what it focuses on was getting a company that wanted to come in and have, I think it was solid waste, they wanted to come into the community, and they were, the EPA has set out some best practices that say come in early before you even start your permitting process, and have some meetings with the community, with their leaders, and basically try to, instead of coming in after you have your permit and facing resistance, what the EPA is trying to encourage is coming in earlier and talking to the community, and depending on how organized the community is, and trying to make sure, to the extent you can, that you won't have this kind of thing going on because everybody's informed. And then it also, they also were, so that did happen in a community, and they had several set of meetings, and went through the permitting process. Well, maybe it's not ultimately a total success story, but which is probably why you asked that question. But they came in, the community seemed fairly, part of it was they felt educated on what was actually going on in this plant that was in their community, and that they were supposed to be getting sort of periodic updates of monitoring about what was going on. And I think actually it was relatively a success up until that last point, which I think after it sounds like a couple of years, and again this was very recent, then the community wasn't really so informed anymore. So there were some questions raised. But at least the siting part went more smoothly than in the past, the permitting process. And I can get you the name. So, but again, the source was the EPA saying, here's where our best practices were implemented. But it was one of the better stories that I heard at a particular conference on environmental justice, because the other kind of success stories would be, winning in litigation and getting something outside, or winning your Civil Rights Act. Okay, so there are some examples of that as well. But if we're talking more about where more of this sort of more closer to a fourth generation approach that's not about litigation, that's maybe trying to have an approach that's non-combative in that way, where there wasn't a mediator, it wasn't truly a collaborative management approach, it was more informational and working with the community at that level. That's probably the best example I can give right at this moment.
We're seeing similar things to that in commission cases where they're talking about high voltage lines across the state, and people getting involved in the local public hearings.
Right.
At the commission level in opposition to it. I'm not sure there'll be any success that comes out of it.
Right, and part of it is you don't necessarily have to. Are there always winners and losers? Yes, in litigation there are. Part of at least one of the goals of environmental justice, in my opinion, and I think this is fairly well shared, is just being able to understand the process and participate in it, and have some knowledge about that, to be heard. Because a lot of, particularly in looking at environmental justice as civil rights, is about creating a space to be heard and sharing information and this equal access to the decision makers. So,
Well, from that standpoint, I can say examples of their success for education.
great. Thank you for that. All right, I know I'm out of time because he's standing up. Thank you so much.